Somebody needs to come here.
Yeah, she was.
Yes, but of course we don't need to think about that. We get to
No,
the question.
great, thank you.
In spite of everything.
No.
His base doesn't change. I mean, there's
I think, yes, I mean, here he does my speaking notes, 9:30 and so on. So,
Yeah.
okay, so shall we kick off? Well, hello and good morning, dear colleagues, and a very warm welcome to all of you. And it is I'm Alexander Dundee, and it's a very great pleasure for me this morning to be chairing this conference and guide you through its program about education as a human right. And that, of course, throws up the attractive concept of lifelong learning. And looking around the room, it's very refreshing to see that in terms of education, that I think all parts of our careers are represented. We have here among us those doing some interesting postgraduate studies, and not least we have my parliamentary colleagues who perhaps now and again, it might be tactfully said, can benefit from lifelong learning to assist them in their further wise directions they take in politics. But, ladies and gentlemen, there we are now at the outset, and we are going to be joined with colleagues online, and our online participants, who I also most warmly welcome, are probably aware of the technical requirements of our video link. And I have to ask our online participants to keep their microphones muted or switched off at all times, unless they're given the floor. If online participants wish to take the floor, please use the function which is called raise your hand, or type a question into the chat function. For those here in the room, a simple show of hands is enough to indicate that you want to speak. On behalf of John Hull, my colleague, who is co-chairing this conference, I have to give his apologies for absence due to his sudden illness today. John, who is leader of our United Kingdom parliamentary delegation to the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, is also a candidate to become the Council of Europe's next Commissioner for Human Rights, which election takes place in Strasbourg next January 2024. Education is the cornerstone of human culture and our societies. Notions such as freedom, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law can only be acquired, really, through education. Hatred, racism, and the glorification of violence acquired through dogma, prejudice, and wrong-headed propaganda subsist outside our democratic and humane traditions and are alien to our international conventions, such as the European Convention on Human Rights. With the world in its present turmoil, it's timely necessary to emphasize good education and better strategies for achieving wide access to quality education. Our international community cannot allow individuals and disadvantaged groups to be denied the human right of education. With these words of welcome, it is a very great pleasure for me now to ask the convener of the House of Lords crossbench peers, Lord Canoe, to open the conference. Lord Canoe, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and can I welcome you to historic Committee Room 1. I say historic here in the House of Lords. I say historic because it was for about 150 years where the Supreme Court, or what is today the Supreme Court, had its home. And they moved out in only 2009 and are now across the way. And that's when the crossbench moved in. So this is our home now for our meetings. And so we will be back here after lunch or when. I think we should begin by congratulating Alexander Dundee and John Howell for their energy in getting this conference, this very important conference, together. And I do that on your behalf and thank them as well, because it's an amazing thing to do, and there are quite a lot of complications in House of Lords processes to just getting you all in here, including online. They both have very fine records, and the records are set out, in fact, just on the front page of the meeting papers. But what is not set out is what I can say is that they're held in a very high regard by their colleagues in their respective chambers who know of their passion in this area and know of their expertise as well. We have a very heavyweight lot of speakers. I can't stay here for everything, I regret. But these speakers will be talking about some very meaty areas, and I think that too is a test to the energy of John and Alexander. We're all here because we believe that education is a human right, so I'm not going to go through what undoubtedly others will go through in terms of the reasoning why one might believe that, but I certainly believe it very firmly. But what is exciting today and what is different today is that really for the first time in the history of mankind over the last 20 years, we've ended up with the tools of delivery of education in a lifelong sense anywhere on the planet. And really what I think we need to do is to stoke up the determination to use those tools and to begin educating people from afar, and all the various benefits that we know flow from liberal education can then start to flow in all sorts of other bits of the world. And that's why I feel that it is very exciting to be here. My predecessor as convener of the crossbench had a maxim, which was that there is no such thing as a speech that is too short. So I fear I've preached the maxim just a very little bit, and I will finish there and say how much I'm looking forward to the rest of the conference.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Charles, for that very effective and interesting opening that you've given us, and also for your strong support for all the previous conferences we've had on subjects including migration rights and so on, which have been most welcome. It is now a great honor for me to give the floor to our first keynote speaker, Mr. Yevhen Kuryavets, who is First Deputy Minister of Education and Science of Ukraine, and who joins us online from Kiev at a moment when Russian air raids have intensified. Minister, thank you very much for being able to address us. You now have the floor.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's a big honor for me to be here and deliver the speech. Today, justice is the right to life of the nation, and our previous speaker said that education is one of the human rights. The right to education for our children and youth has been fought for by Ukrainians with arms in hand. And under attack is our country, our future, our education, and over 3,500 educational institutions have been damaged or completely destroyed during the full-scale war. Every 10th school in Ukraine has been affected by the shellings. According to the World Bank estimate, the damage from the actions of the Russian Federation in the first year of the full-scale invasion required $10 billion for restoration. We are currently providing updated information for assessment and working with the World Bank and our partners to estimate the figure because it has been increased during the last year. Currently, education in Ukraine is interrupted by air raid alarms, yet the desire for development persists. Ukrainian school children and students continue their education in shelters, online, and even from occupied territories in Ukrainian educational institutions with our teachers. The challenges and directions of our work can now be divided into two main groups. First of all, the restoration of access to education. Just imagine, approximately almost 2 million children do not have the opportunity for regular in-person learning. Almost 50% of the total student population in Ukraine and are studying remotely or in a blended format. The reason for this is the destroyed infrastructure, the inability to resume face-to-face learning in regions with worsened security situations, and the lack of proper shelter. In 10 regions of Ukraine, 80% of children are studying remotely or in mixed form of education. The flight time of missile in these areas is too short to ensure safety in schools, even if they have shelter. Millions of Ukrainian children have faced various lengths of interruptions in their education. Bridging educational losses is a separate focus area for the education system. Another part of our priority in working with the government its continuation and provision of reforms and system transformation during the full-scale war. For us, it is important not only to rebuild walls, but also to fill them with new content, creating an environment for the development of quality education. We are currently continuing reforms in schools, higher education, vocational education in the same time. We are fighting for the future, so we cannot stop building it, stop learning, and stop growing. It's highly important for us to understand that emergency response is highly important. However, to emphasize the need of the reforms, it's crucial for the future. A significant indicator this year has been about 20,000 applicants who took exams in special organized centers abroad to enter Ukrainian universities. The Ministry of Education and Science will support both students studying abroad and their maximum comfort upon their return to Ukraine. For us, it is a priority to make maximum efforts to restore access to education now. This includes shelters, providing devices in areas when it's not possible to go even to shelter, buses to deliver them to a safer place, programs to compensate for educational losses, and mental health program, of course. I have shared the statistics with you. However, I would like to point on some good examples. For example, we have the guy, 11 years old, Mikita, in Zaporizhia region, who dreams of programming but couldn't attend robotics clubs because his village is an area where the air raid alarm doesn't reach in time. Victoria, from Kharkiv region, in 10 years old, the eldest child in a large family, shared the phone with siblings, the only gadget from which she could join online classes. Elizabeth, 17 years old, who thanks to online education managed to prepare for entrance exams and enroll in the university she dreamed of. We have the story of Ukrainian kid from Kherson region last year when they have been under the occupation yet and they have participated in international competition of Genius Olympiad and have won gold medal even using Wi-Fi from the post office under the attack. This and hundreds of thousands of other stories of real people are the reason we won't stop. These children don't stop learning, striving for development, and achieving their goals. They constantly inspire us to do everything within our power and even more. Today, our support in the restoration of education and development. It would take us decades to rebuild and reform education on our own. Therefore, this support is invaluable. During this war, dozens of new countries have become shelters for many Ukrainian children and students, safe place for them. Today, I want to express my gratitude separately to the people and the government of the United Kingdom for the warm welcome of our education applicants and help during the toughest times for the entire Ukraine. When your right to education is threatened by a missile, the occupying forces of the Russian Federation and power cuts, fighting for it is not an easy task. But every day when Ukrainian children go to school, Ukrainian educators are fighting. We disrupt the enemy's plans to destroy our future. Thank you for this time, for your attention of Ukraine problems, and for your love and productive dialogue about Ukraine. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I hope this event will be great.
Mr. Kudryavitz, your work is essential just now. We've heard your words and are in solidarity with you and your country, wishing you and all Ukrainian students and teachers every possible success in your difficult and almost impossible circumstances. With this inspiring but also alarming keynote speech, which we have just had the privilege of hearing from the Minister, we now come to the debate sessions of our conference. And in session one on education as human rights, we're very pleased to hear from Fabian Hamilton, who was former Shadow Minister for Europe and the Middle East, and then from Sir Ian Livingstone, General Partner of Hyro Capital and former skills champion of the United Kingdom government. First, Fabian Hamilton, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Lord Dundee, and it is a pleasure and a privilege to be here at this very important conference on such an important day and to follow the Minister live from Ukraine. Thank you, Minister. That was a very inspiring introduction and keynote speech. Before I begin, let me just lay out some more of my credentials, if I may, because before becoming a Member of Parliament, I chaired the Education Committee of Leeds City Council, the city in which I'm a Member of Parliament. So I've had a long involvement in state education, and indeed my wife was a teacher in further education in the city of Leeds. Following my election in 1997, a long time ago now, Lord Dundee, I became very involved with international relations and foreign affairs through the Foreign Affairs Committee before becoming a shadow minister for 8 years until September. I also covered Latin America, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Indian subcontinent, so most of the world, in fact. So that's, I guess, why you've asked me to say a few words today, and I will try, as the Earl of Kinnoul did, to keep it brief. So I've got a short speech here of introduction. The human right to education was first enshrined in Article 2 of the first protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights more than 7 decades ago now. However, many constitutions of the Council of Europe's member states often contain this right even earlier, but it was incorporated effectively into all newly democratic constitutions in Central and Eastern Europe following the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and through legislative assistance by the Council of Europe to its newly democratic member states in the early 1990s. Now, you may be familiar with the phrase 2 lawyers, 3 opinions. It's one I know very well since both my parents were lawyers, and I always heard those 3 opinions from those 2 lawyers. But I'm not going to add another opinion. I should, however, draw your attention to the elaborate and precise jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, which has extensively interpreted and applied Article 2 of the first protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights through its case law. Now, you'll find in the conference room the guide to this case law, which I think we've all got in front of us, produced by the European Court. This guide has more than 20 pages, but don't panic. I'm not going to read out the guide in full, mainly because it wouldn't be possible anyway in the time allocated to me. So let me just underline and draw your attention to a few of the key aspects. Firstly, Article 2 uses the quite simple and clear formulation, and I quote, "No person shall be denied the right to education." In this sense, Article 2 is a clear human right which protects the individual against a state authority. In this context, denying the right to education. A human right typically protects against state interference or denial. Now, this approach is specified in Article 2 by its second sentence, which says, and again I quote, "In the exercise of any functions which it assumes in relation to education and to teaching, the state shall respect the right of parents to ensure such education and teaching in conformity with their own religious and philosophical convictions." Now, this sentence reflects the fact that historically many older higher education institutions were founded centuries ago by religious communities throughout the continent of Europe. But it also reflects the historic stand taken by autocracies to promote state indoctrination under the umbrella of totalitarian philosophies. Parental authority over their children was seen as the best, or at least the most suitable protection against such anti-democratic philosophies. Now, of course, there is an important caveat today. The military aggression by Russia against Ukraine clearly challenges the human right to education, as we've just heard from the Ukrainian education minister online. In today's Russia, of course, Putin pursues a state philosophy of Russification, nationalism, and oligarchic corruption, often far worse than the Stalin years some 80 years ago. In the occupied territories of Ukraine today, parents are denied any freedom to express their philosophical convictions. Article 2, however, is also a human right, which constitutes a positive obligation upon signatory states. And this is perhaps the most effective aspect of the human right to education. It makes the difference between law in the reference books and law in action. Individuals are not left alone with the task of education, but the state positively enables it. Now, in the United Kingdom earlier this year, Parliament passed the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which aims to ensure freedom of speech and academic freedom, in stark contrast to what Putin has tried to enforce upon Russian students today. In addition, we're currently debating the Lifelong Learning Higher Education Fee Limits Bill, which would establish better and wider access to education, especially for those students with few resources, as well as those continuing their higher education after work or whilst working. I should also mention in this context, of course, Lord Dundee's International Higher Education and Research Bill, a copy of which I think you have in front of you, which would widen the narrowly national horizon of our legislation and would enable international cooperation, especially post-Brexit, for the benefit of both students as well as higher education and research institutions in the United Kingdom. I wish you luck with that, Lord Dundee. I hope it gets through both houses very smoothly and without amendment. Through this legislation, Parliament could give much more meaning and shape to the positive obligation of states regarding the right to education. Now, let me conclude my brief introduction with the question, why should democratic states care about widening and enforcing the right to education? Well, of course, democratic governments obviously do not want to promote doctrinaire or any other state-imposed philosophies, but rather seek to oppose and even prevent such centrally imposed philosophies. But beyond that basic assumption, it's clear that our societies are currently faced with multiple challenges at present. Rapid technological change, which makes many current jobs redundant, as well as globalization, which brings our society into competition with many other parts of the world. And at the same time, of course, we're experiencing an unprecedented global enrichment of societies and individuals through greater connectivity, but that's also challenged by new levels of hatred and sometimes, too often, violence. Now, similarly to the human rights to freedom of thought and freedom of speech or expression, the human right to education is a cornerstone of a democratic, free, liberal and humane society. The curiosity of children needs to be guided and supported in order to achieve the positive and humane progress of each individual as well as society as a whole. Now, without such positive, enabling and democratic philosophies, the action to go with it, the United Kingdom and indeed Europe will not have the strength to face the coming challenges. Finally, I'm now delighted to hand over to the other speakers who can better explain to us what they've been successfully doing to help achieve this country's vital success in Europe. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Fabian, for that excellent delivery. As you mentioned, education is not only a legal right, but it requires strategies and efforts to make education accessible and effective for everybody. In that connection, I'm now very pleased to be able to give the floor to Sir Ian Livingston, who is not only credited as the father of the United Kingdom online games industry, but is also very active in new approaches to education. So Ian, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well done, Des. Well done, Dee. I'm not an educationist, but I have a huge respect for the teaching profession. And whilst I believe children obviously have the democratic right to education, I think they also need an education that actually works for them, what they are taught and how they are taught. Children are naturally curious, love learning at school, but sometimes dislike school. I was one of them. I've been privileged to work in the UK games industry for over 4 decades. I co-founded Games Workshop in 1975, launched Dungeons and Dragons and Warhammer in the UK, games which sparked the imagination, necessitated communication and required strategic thinking. In 1982, I wrote The Warlock of Firetop Mountain, a fighting fantasy game book in which you, the reader, are the hero. Fighting fantasy game books are not like linear novels. They are interactive, branching narrative which place the reader at the heart of the story, giving them control over their destiny. Choice is empowering. Children read and play through the book, deciding which way to go, solving puzzles, finding treasure, and rolling dice to slay monsters, all very exciting for their imaginations. Yet there was strong criticism at the time. People wanted them banned, petitions sent in, when I'm going to write a proper book. All this was happening at the time when they were selling in huge numbers. Some 20 million copies were sold. They were great for reluctant readers. They got a whole generation of children reading, and also at the same time increased literacy levels, problem solving, and critical thinking skills. I moved into video games in the 1990s and launched Lara Croft Tomb Raider, amongst others. Yes, playing games is fun, but think about the cognitive process of what is happening when people play games. Games require problem solving, intuitive learning, trial and error, logic, analysis, communication, risk-taking, planning, and resource management. Games encourage creativity and curiosity, Games give continuous assessment and do not punish people for making mistakes. When playing a game like Minecraft, effectively digital Lego, a child learns that applying the heat of a furnace to silica sand produces glass, which they can put into their game world. And they won't forget that, because it's learning by doing. Simulation games are used as a training tool for pilots, surgeons, the armed forces, and professionals. So why not apply principles of games-based learning to aspects of the national curriculum to add context? Deeper understanding comes from learning by doing more than rote learning of facts. Moving on to technology, we're well aware that we're now in a world where AI and robots will replace many jobs which involve repetition. And children, therefore, should be encouraged to be creative. That will differentiate them from the robots. Developing video games, for example, is a marriage of art and technology, requiring a combination of technical expertise and creative flair. Not every child will want to become a software engineer, but they need to know how code works. They will benefit from being in the driving seat of digital creativity rather than the passenger seat of digital consumption. A convenient option in some schools is for children to simply use proprietary software in ICT lessons. Whilst Word, PowerPoint, and Excel are useful in themselves, they give children no understanding of how to create their own software. They can play a game, but they can't make a game. They can use a website, they can't build a website. That is like teaching children how to read, but not how to write. Computers are a tool to enable digital creativity for the maker generation. Computer science is not just about coding, it's a discipline, a broad mix of computational thinking, problem solving, logic, analysis, and creative thinking to be used cross-curricular to solve problems in multiple ways. In a world where computers define so much of how society works, from how we do business to how we enjoy ourselves, computer science is essential knowledge for the 21st century. But moving on to the arts, which is equally important in my opinion, creativity gives the UK an edge as a nation. Imagination is key also to the maker generation. The arts should not be something which is simply nice to have, seen at best as a booster for other subjects, but not counting in the EBAC. The arts are often seen as a luxury, something which can be sacrificed in favour of more rigorous subjects to which standardised tests and metrics can be applied. This is a grave misunderstanding of cultural value. The creative industries is the fastest growing industrial sector in the UK economy. Beyond the creative industries, the arts benefit all industries in terms of ideas creation and design. Difficult to test or measure their intangible value, creative subjects are often marginalised in the curriculum on the grounds that students will be better served concentrating on STEM subjects to get a proper job. This, in my opinion, is wrong and missing the point. An authentic education for the digital world requires the government to evolve the curriculum, bringing the arts and sciences together to encourage innovation. By adding an A for the arts to the mantra of STEAM, the mantra should be STEAM, not STEM education. The knowledge economy is driven by original ideas which are turned into products and services. The value is in the IP created. Apple knows this. The form and functionality of the iPhone made it a world beater, the product of a marriage between the arts and sciences. The commercial value, however, is not in the low margin physical manufacturing of the iPhone, but in the intellectual property of the services it provides through the App Store. My own education input, having benefited from all my life in games, is that we opened the Livingstone Academy 2 years ago, which adopts a STEAM model and encourages learning by doing project-based learning and problem solving. We welcome that human beings are different, good at some things, less good at others. But can't see the point of a standardized testing against the same metric in examination. Why make children feel bad about subjects they have no interest in and do not do well in? I'm a Manchester City fan, football fan, and it's a bit like Pep Guardiola saying to Erling Haaland, Erling, you score some really great goals, but you really should kind of get to work on your goalkeeping. Something obviously he'll never do. Teaching needs to be in sync with the 21st century and be delivered in a manner that is natural to them. A curriculum based on knowledge recall is outmoded. The Livingstone Academy focuses on skills as well as qualifications and know-how as well as knowledge. Our students aim to be work-ready and world-ready. We are not, however, training our pupils for jobs, but we do want them to be well prepared for the world. Many children in schools today will have jobs that do not even exist, so there's no point in training them like robots, as they won't be able to compete with the real thing. The Livingstone Academy is a state school where we want our pupils to achieve good examination results through multidisciplinary learning and collaboration. Our model is based on the use of games-based and project-based cross-curricular learning, which has proved to be both popular and successful. We are equipping pupils with know-how and skills for the 21st century. We encourage creativity and diverse thinking in children, give them digital making skills and an entrepreneurial mindset so that they might aspire to be job makers rather than just job seekers. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sirian. We now have a few minutes for questions and discussions. Who would like to take the floor first? Anybody online? Yes, yes.
Thank you, and thank you for a series of fascinating speeches. Sirian, I just wanted to come back on the STEAM piece, because Robin Walker, I chair the Education Select Committee in the Commons. We are in the process of launching an inquiry on screen time. And I think you want to look at both the positives and the negatives of children being able to use screens. I think you'll recognise that there's big debates about use of mobile phones in schools, about the amount of time it's healthy for children to spend in front of screens. Firstly, I'd be delighted if you would come and talk to the committee about your perspective from the games industry, because I think that would be really interesting for people to hear, and the role of games in education. But have you looked at what you think is a healthy degree of time for children to spend in front of a screen or interacting with screens versus face-to-face learning?
I think clearly you have to have a balance in life. I would not recommend children spending their whole lives on screens, but it's not so much about playing games that they spend most of their time. It's more around social media, the prolific use of social media that they get entwined with. And I think that needs to be looked at more deeply than the games industry, which I believe, as I said, is a powerful good in learning in multiple ways, engaged. And naturally, when we arrive in this world as babies, we learn through play. Play is a natural learning thing. So games have always been perceived as a negative thing, and I think they're absolutely a positive thing in child's development. But getting back to your point, I'm not sure how you can legislate about it, because technology is around us, and we have to learn to adapt our behaviour to the digital world in which we immerse ourselves. So we have to make sure that children fully understand the implications and also the positives, how they can use their devices in a positive sense rather than in a negative sense.
Well, thank you. I wonder if I could ask this question. Following the terrorist attack by Hamas against Israel, as well as the Russian military attack against Ukraine, we've seen an enormous flood of agitation and propaganda filled with hatred coming online. Education, and indeed media education, can play a central role in helping the public to reject such indoctrination. Do we perhaps therefore need more lifelong learning of media competency? I wonder if both speakers might wish to comment on that. Fabian, would you like to?
Yes, of course, Lord Dundee. Well, the answer has to be yes. I mean, let me just touch on Robin's question for a minute, because I know it's addressed to Sirian, but I have two small grandsons, 3.5 and 7. Now, when I was bringing my children up, of course, screens weren't an issue, but they certainly are now. And I think there has to be a combination of the usefulness of a screen to help learn through play, which certainly my 7-year-old grandson is adapted to quite well, and the rationing of that screen time. Because the 3.5-year-old, if left to his own devices, would just sit in front of it the whole time. So it has to be controlled. There has to be some discipline there, so that the children understand when it's appropriate, when it isn't, but they enjoy it when it is appropriate. I think on the question you asked about hate speech, this is something that tragically we're all trying to tackle at the moment in our own constituencies as elected members, and of course those of us who aren't representatives will tackle it in society and in our own communities. What I'm finding as a representative of a constituency that has an almost equal number of Jewish and Muslim constituents is that you have to try and steer a middle path through that says that let us not allow Hamas, who destroyed so many Jewish lives, and the bombing of Gaza that's destroyed so many Palestinian lives, separate the harmony that we've enjoyed in our communities. I don't know about London, but certainly in the city of Leeds, we are privileged to enjoy very good community relations. So much so that when Muslims first arrived in Leeds, they went to the kosher butchers to buy their meat because that was allowed. That was not haram. It was allowed under Islamic law. And that collaboration, that cooperation, that friendship, that mutual respect must not be torn asunder by hatred. Now, how we tackle hatred, I don't know. I'm not an expert at this, but it seems to me that the opposite of that kind of remote hate speech is knowing one another better and not being frightened of one another. And the problem with a lot of hate speech on the internet, on social media sites, is that it encourages those of us in that bubble to view the other as distant, as not human, as not part of our society, as having nothing in common with us. Whereas we know, for example, in the Jewish and Islamic faiths, there's so much more that's in common between those two faiths in terms of theocracy than there is, and laws, than there is that divides them, which is Israel-Palestine. So I think sharing our common humanity together is, in a way, the best method of pushing back the hatred that some social media can encourage and indeed develop.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Online education and culture are vital elements of education during a crisis or conflict. Lord Blasey has been the longest serving Minister of State for Culture and the Digital Economy of the United Kingdom. I'm therefore very grateful to him for joining us today. Edward, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you very much, Alexander. It's very kind of you to invite me. I'm here because I share a room with Alexander Dundee. So whenever he's organising an event and I happen to be in the room, I get asked to attend. So that's very nice. There may be another reason as well, which is I was the tech minister for many years under Lord Cameron, as we must now learn to call him, and it's very good to see the band getting back together again in the House of Lords to take control of government and lead us forward. And I also was lucky enough in that role to work with Sir Ian Livingstone, and in fact the first report I commissioned as a minister became known as the Livingstone Report, which was focused on education and skills, and indeed digital skills, to try and promote the digital skills that our kids need to navigate a 21st century economy. And Ian strongly recommended that we put digital skills into the national curriculum, coding into the national curriculum. And as the minister who had commissioned the report, I told him there was no way on earth he would get that through the government, and that Michael Gove would resist it at all costs. And Ian went to present his report to Michael Gove, and as sure as eggs is eggs, Michael Gove said, "That's a brilliant idea, Ian, let's do it." So coding is now in the national curriculum, although it's very important, I think, to remember when government, as it were, with the stroke of a pen, decides that something is a good thing and should be taught in our schools, that you have to do the doing as well. You have to make sure you have teachers with the right skills and expertise and incentives to teach these very important skills. But I know that we're looking at this issue partly through the prism of Ukraine. I think you've heard from Minister Kudryavets already. And I also work with an online education company called Perlego, which describes itself as the Spotify for textbooks. And so I kind of see firsthand how education is changing. And in effect, through Perlego, you can get access to thousands of textbooks online. And it is a new way of digital learning, if you like, taking the old textbook model. Textbooks are extremely expensive, making it cheaper, but also making sure that textbooks can be updated in real time. It's just a small example of why digital education is so important. And I'm a big fan of digital education across the board, because I think that one of the things that frustrates me, if you like, about education at the moment, traditional education, is that most of our Victorian forebears could certainly walk into this room and be extremely familiar with its surroundings, but they could also walk into a classroom and be very familiar. And I don't think we're taking advantage enough of technology and how it can really change the way children learn in a good way. And what I mean by that is the opportunity, for example, to provide personalized curriculums, to be able to identify specific weaknesses in a pupil's learning and then drill down and reinforce the learning opportunities for that particular pupil. Ian himself, I don't know if you've spoken already or mentioned it, has opened a school in Bournemouth, which I was privileged enough to go to the opening, talking about the gamification of learning, using gaming techniques to reinforce learning. And I think that's a really good example where one should go with the grain of how children live their lives today. I heard what Fabian said about being unable to get his three and a half year old grandchild off a screen. I thought there are also 55-year-old peers who can't get off their screens as well. But I do think that rather than necessarily say all of that is a bad thing, one must acknowledge that different people, we now have a different way of engaging with content. I know that Ukraine itself as well obviously has a fantastic digital ecosystem. It certainly did before the war. I've worked with a number of companies who had a lot of people based in Ukraine doing coding. So they have a huge amount of expertise in that area. It was a very thriving tech economy before the war. So it's again something that is very important. I mean, it is difficult to imagine the challenges and hardships that Ukraine has faced since the war began, schools and universities being attacked, students and teachers being displaced. So it's no surprise that online education has been one of the opportunities, as it were, to try and have some semblance of normal education. And also it means that refugee students in the UK and in other places can also continue their educational path, have contact with fellow students and teachers. And what Ukraine is going through is far worse than we experienced during the COVID pandemic, but the COVID pandemic in the UK is a good example where digital online education as a human right, was able to be maintained in some shape or form. And I'm pleased that online education proved its reliability during COVID. It showed how reliant we are on the digital sector, and it also reinforces our need to protect the digital sector from attempts to undermine it through viruses, hacking, manipulations, and other things. I know that Ukraine has relied heavily on Starlink from SpaceX, landlines and infrastructure being destroyed or missing, but again, the ability of Starlink to fill a gap doesn't undermine the need to protect landlines and hardware infrastructure in the same way we'd want to protect electricity networks through Europe. So we need strategies in place to make those networks as robust as possible. I think it's important to have this debate here because Britain does have a unique role to play in international education. One of my other hats is to be chair of the UK ASEAN Business Council, and in my trips to Southeast Asia, I am really reminded of the soft power, if you like, as well as the economic power of the British education system, not just the English language, which is the lingua franca of science, trade, industry and culture, but also the fact that our higher education system has effectively provided the model for so many countries around the world with its bachelor and master's degrees as well. So we have in Britain an obligation to participate in international cooperation in the education field. Even after Brexit, it's vital, in my view, that we place a huge emphasis on cross-border cooperation with EU member states and with countries like Ukraine, because education is a human right, a humane necessity, and if we're going to allow everyone to take part and achieve progress, then we have to do that as well. Violations of human right to education must be investigated and adjudicated by the European Court of Human Rights and national courts. I think education ministers have to establish a framework for closer cooperation in education and research across national borders. Regardless of Brexit, all the countries in Europe have a long tradition based on common values, and that should be our watchword. And we must give education institutions and students as much opportunity as possible for exchange and cooperation. We've always thrived by students going abroad. They come back and benefit our societies as well. When I go to Southeast Asia, I'm told time and time again, despite all the numerous initiatives that the UK undertakes, the kind of gold standard is the Chevening Scholarship Programme, which allows students from Southeast Asia to come and study in the UK. They get a great understanding of British culture. By and large, from what I can work out, they gain a huge affection for our country, and that kind of connection is literally, in my view, priceless. We've got students now growing up, as Fabian pointed out, using digital media that crosses national borders. And it's an interesting angle as well to kind of engage with what I would loosely call informal education. Even my children, both at very good schools, gain so much of their learning through endless scrolling through TikToks. It's important to understand what is going on, and education institutions have to cope with this phenomenon. But no one should be left behind in education, and the cohesion and success of our societies depend on support for the weakest members in our society as well. The costs for society and each individual are too high if we accept that parts of our society remain uneducated. So education support is a win-win situation. Lord Dundee, I'd like to thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to make these reflections.
Well, I would thank you very much indeed for everything that you've said.
You're looking at me like you look at me when I don't put paper in the printer.
I have to say that your eloquence is of a rather higher standard than I'm accustomed when I listen to what you have to say, when I have no choice but to look at you as I get down to some serious hard work at my desk. But thank you very much. And this leads us to our second session under the heading Human Rights, Education and Education for Democratic Citizenship, where all of us will be very pleased to welcome Dr. Kate Moriarty, Head of Human Rights Education at Amnesty International in London, as well as Sarah Keating, who is Head of the Formal and Non-Formal Education Division of the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. May we start with the human rights NGO Amnesty International, which has been very active in human rights education throughout Europe for many years, even in Russia, where NGOs are legally suppressed today. Dr. Moriarty, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lord Dundee, and thank you, everybody else. So, first of all, just thank you for the invitation for Amnesty to be here, and I'm really happy to contribute to this discussion from the perspective of human rights education, and bring some sort of focus on conflict, which we've already heard from the Minister in Ukraine. So colleagues have already mentioned the sort of long history of the right to education, and I just wanted to mention the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has its 75th anniversary in December this year, where in the aftermath of World War II and the atrocities, the right to education, along with other human rights, were laid out. And since World War II, we've seen that the right to education has been enshrined in multiple legally binding documents, such as the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and as already mentioned, in the European Convention on Human Rights, all of which are widely endorsed and ratified by states around the world, including the UK and obviously members of the Council of Europe. So education is a universal, indivisible human right for all, without discrimination. And denying the right to education not only violates that right in itself, but also hampers the enjoyment of other rights and fundamental freedoms. And I just wanted to sort of draw our attention. We've been talking about the right to education, but I think it relates to these comments that we've already been talking about, sort of, of tolerance or hatred, and remind us that in the Universal Declaration of Rights and in other frameworks, education, the purpose of education, and I'm sort of quoting here from the UDHR, is that education is directed at the full development of the human personality and to strengthening respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance and friendship among all nations, racial or religious groups, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. So I think remembering what the purpose of education is, as well as the academic side, is really important. And Amnesty International advocates for a holistic approach to quality human rights education. Human rights education is a very powerful tool which helps prevent future human rights violations and violence, as well as fighting racism, hatred, extremism, xenophobia, discrimination and intolerance. Amnesty's core work in human rights education takes place in both formal and non-formal education sectors and spans very diverse global initiatives, from working with on female genital mutilation in West Africa to addressing issues around sexual violence and consent in Europe, and many more. And more than half of the human rights education work that we undertake at Amnesty takes place in the formal education sector, but also importantly with adults. In the context of the UK, Amnesty International calls on the government to offer human rights education in a range of settings, including as part of the school curriculum. And in a recent UK-wide survey, we were asked, to what extent, if at all, do you consider the following important or unimportant? Children and young people being taught human rights. And 82% of the respondents said that it was very important or fairly important that we taught children and young people about human rights. So we would like to, see that strengthened both within the UK and across Council of Europe members. And we'd also suggest within the context of the UK that the next iteration of the Education Inspection Handbook should have a section that evaluates the extent to which human rights are promoted and protected within education institutions. I want to talk about the right to education in conflict and also human rights education in conflict. And we've heard from the Minister of Education in Ukraine about the many challenges of the right to education and of the courage of the students and teachers. And I think, we should not forget that around the world, in Ukraine and in other conflicts around the world, that the right to education is being disrupted and denied. But that right is not suspended during conflict. In fact, other protections come in. Schools, as well as hospitals, as you know, have a special protection under international humanitarian law. However, there's many examples of which Amnesty has documented some. For example, in northern Nigeria, Boko Haram attacking schools, killing students, the Saudi coalition deliberately bombing schools in Yemen. And we're seeing new and protracted conflicts that are leading to really appalling human tragedies. We're witnessing an escalation of the grave violations of human rights and humanitarian law taking place in the conflict in Gaza and Israel, including the deliberate targeting of schools. The Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine has resulted in grave violations of humanitarian human rights law, and as we've heard, it's disrupting the educations of millions of children. Going back to that vision of the UDHR and also within the rights of the child, it's really clear that the purpose of education extends beyond the academic learning, as well as that being very important. And it includes the promotion of values such as human rights, of peace and of tolerance, regardless of children's circumstances. And this remains equally relevant for children living in or having lived through conflict. Empowering effective individuals with critical knowledge and skills, it fosters resilience, aids in healing and promotes peace, crucial for rebuilding communities and instilling respect for human rights, especially among younger generations. Among the different initiatives Amnesty to respond to a crisis, Amnesty focus on both the right to education and human rights education during conflict. In the Middle East and North Africa region, for example, our human rights education with activists enables them to document human rights violations. In other settings, such as in Burkina Faso, we're working with conflict or post-conflict affected communities, working an issue where conflict can increase the chance of early childhood marriage, so working with communities to reduce that. We've launched online programs on the right to on refugee rights, and then on the ground in countries surrounding Ukraine who have seen a high mobilization of movement of refugees into their communities. We're working with schools and teachers to give support to welcome Ukrainian refugees. For example, in Poland, there's a campaign called Schools for All that is really about helping to accommodate the more than 200,000 refugee children from Ukraine. In the UK, Amnesty's national latest teacher training programme, which started just the weekend past, includes a focus on how to approach discussions around the conflict in Israel and Palestine, which are coming up in classrooms everywhere. So supporting educators is really vital to the right to education for both traumatised and displaced children and for teachers. But teachers offer a very crucial stability and aid in the sort of, coping with the conflict, ensuring continuous learning and psychosocial support, as in the case of Ukraine and in other conflicts. Given the war's severe impact on Ukraine, as we heard from the Minister, we think it's vital for the Council of Europe future programs to really support not only education institutions but also youth movements and ensuring human rights education aligns with the Charter. I'm just coming to the end of my time. I just wanted to mention that also within our human rights education work at Amnesty, we're currently developing resources to help people understand the international humanitarian law and human rights in conflict and the historical context of the conflict in Gaza and Israel. So I'll conclude my remarks by saying that I think today's discussion really underscores the crucial role of states in upholding the right to education, even amidst conflict and displacement. I know we're going to hear from the Office of the High Commission for Refugees shortly. It emphasises the importance of embedding human rights education in all learning environments to empower people with rights awareness. It's vital for states to implement concrete measures that bolsters education role in fostering respect for human rights, understanding, tolerance and peace, especially in this increase in the world where we've seen, and that has been mentioned, increased conflict and intolerance. And we call on the UK government and the Council of Europe to really strengthen its support for human rights education. And just finally to say that, we stand in solidarity with all those students and teachers everywhere in the world and all the children that are still denied that right to education. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much indeed. And this takes us to the Council of Europe, which is called the beacon of human rights in Europe. May I give the floor to Sarah Keating from Strasbourg.
Thank you very much.
Sarah, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Lord Dundee. Our topic today, education as a human right and cornerstone for any democratic society, really goes to the very heart of the Council of Europe's work, and indeed its raison d'etre to promote human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in and through education. No one is born knowing what democracy and human rights are, not in more established democracies, nor in newer democracies. Democracy and human rights must be learned by each and every generation, and most of all experienced, something we've already heard about before. The risk of not educating our citizens to live in a democratic society is real. In the Council of Europe Secretary General's annual report, she mentions a clear and worrying degree of democratic backsliding. She points to evidence in Europe from the judiciary to freedom of expression, and of course to the deep impact of Russia's ongoing aggression against Ukraine. This is why in May of this year, the Council of Europe organized its 4th Summit of Heads of State in Reykjavik, and it's only the 4th in the organization's 73-year history, and it was entitled United Around Values. Values. Indeed, it is values which unite us and are non-negotiable. This is why the Russian Federation was expelled from the Council of Europe only weeks after its invasion of Ukraine, and why at the summit the heads of state affirmed that they were united against Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. At the summit, which included Prime Minister Sunak, the Reykjavik principles of democracy were also adopted. One of the 10 principles focuses on education and calls upon member states to promote the participation of young people in democratic life and decision-making processes, notably through education initiatives on human rights and democratic values, such as pluralism, inclusion, non-discrimination, transparency, and accountability. It's also a clear sign that education is high on the political agenda of our member states. Just a few months later, in September of this year, the Council of Europe organized in Strasbourg its 26th Standing Conference of Ministers of Education. Ministers from 43 member states met on the topic of transformative power of education, universal values, and civic renewal. The conference set out new priorities and actions to implement the Reykjavik principles for democracy, and at that conference we were very honored that Minister Halfin participated. So what were the results of this conference? First, the ministers launched the new Council of Europe Education Strategy, Learners First, and I'd like to emphasize learners, education for today's and tomorrow's democratic societies, and adopted 5 resolutions to reaffirm the critical role of education in promoting democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. The strategy is composed of 3 pillars, but I'll just focus on the first pillar, which is renewing the democratic and civic mission of education. Now, of course, we didn't start from zero at the Council of Europe in this area, and the ministers clearly acknowledged the need to build upon the acquis of the Council of Europe over the last 20 years. This includes the Council of Europe Charter on Education for Democratic Citizenship and Human Rights Education, and the Reference Framework of Competencies for Democratic Culture. These are 20 competencies which break down democracy into tangible parts centered around values, attitudes, skills, knowledge, and critical understanding. They include, for instance, critical thinking and empathy, and provide a basis to reform policies, curricula, teacher training, and materials. The ministers also underlined the need to broaden the use of these competencies throughout the curriculum areas and to all levels of education. Schools simply cannot keep adding new courses and maintain the same structure. And 1 hour of civic education a week isn't enough. Learning how to vote and how government works, of course, is very important. But fostering democratic competencies will provide learners with the understanding they need in the future and improve the quality of education. Their use in the daily life of learners will help them to confront and address issues such as peer violence, mental health, also coupled with the greater demands on teachers to act as educators. Another area identified by the Ministers of Education is vocational education and training. In many Council of Europe member states, more than half of students attend secondary vocational schools. And we've seen that this constructive social dialogue can be increased by promoting democratic citizenship in vocational schools. And of course, these are important life skills for young people and can help employers too. It's also very exciting to see all of this work being put into practice in our member states. In the UK, for instance, the Association for Citizenship Teaching identified how schools take different approaches to promote a democratic citizenship through curriculum, school culture, and in the community. In their research, the key features for success include citizenship as a separate subject taught by trained and committed teachers, along with student-led projects and support from senior leaders. And some of the quotes from the students were that they felt that they could really continue to positive changes by treating others well, raising awareness about injustice, and taking inspiration from change makers. Another example is Turkey, and I was involved in this project, where a new course on democracy and human rights was developed by the Ministry of National Education with the support of the Council of Europe, which now 1.3 million children take a year. All 10-year-olds in Turkey take this compulsory course, developed with the tools of the Council of Europe. In other projects, we have seen how bullying in schools has decreased by engaging students and the whole community in the management of their schools. Learning how to deal better with controversial issues and media literacy also helps build resistance. And again, seeing and talking to students in some schools in very remote areas and how now they want to go to school because there's less violence in school is very encouraging and inspiring. But the ministers decided to go one step further and asked the Council of Europe to bring all of this work together under one umbrella by launching a new European space for citizenship education. Now, what would this involve? To underpin this space, the ministers have asked the Council of Europe to develop a new framework convention for citizenship education. Such a legal instrument will codify all of the above instruments, and it will also include recommendations from the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe on democratic citizenship, and of course the the basis, the European Convention on Human Rights, and will also add new areas which have developed over the years, such as digital citizenship education and education for sustainable development. It will serve as a one-stop shop for the promotion of democratic values in education in Europe. And of course, this will take time to develop and negotiate with member states. It will also create a space for cooperation between member states, sharing of good practices and exchanges. This could be online, but even better face-to-face. And we've seen how rich these experiences can be. For instance, when education officials from other European countries have visited London, Cardiff, and Edinburgh. In conclusion, we hope that these initiatives will ensure a democratic future for learners in a practical and meaningful way. As the chair of the Council of Europe Committee of Ministers said, our continent's oldest multilateral organization, the Council of Europe, is considered the conscience of Europe, and never in our lifetime has Europe needed its conscience more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, and also for so kindly travelling from Strasbourg, especially to be with us today. It's very much appreciated. We now have a little time for discussion and questions. Who might like to begin? Yes, please.
My name is Tejendra Ferali. I'm a professor at University College London. I'm very pleased to be here with some of my wonderful students who are specializing in conflict management and peace. So when I was invited to join this conference, and I was quite inspired by the idea that education as a human right and the significance of education in promoting and enabling rights at a very challenging moment that we live in, when the violence is ongoing and educational and human rights are being violated. And one of the points that I wanted to make is that education is a powerful tool for enabling those rights, but also education is a hugely political process. Education can contribute to exacerbate existing conditions of inequalities, discriminations, and hardening those political ideologies, which could be quite detrimental for the well-being and thriving society. Teaching history in a very biased way and promoting one kind of narrative is always dangerous, as we've seen, and also that some of the extremist views that are being promoted are also done through education. So I think it's very important to think about education not only in the sense of what happens within formal educational settings, but also in a broad sense where education is actually used to perpetrate and reproduce conditions of violence. For example, the social media is an example where we are constantly bombarded with the same kind of material, which actually contributes to harden our thinking and belief rather than enabling us to think about the alternative views. And I think it's very, very dangerous. So I would want to think about education in a critical manner rather than uncritically believing that education leads to a positive outcome and for peace in society.
Thank you. I wondered, and thank you for being wanting to ask a further question, but let's deal with your question first. And I wonder on this very useful, penetrating question, which challenges the balance of education to avoid the unwelcome extremes in how it does, which is very much a Council of Europe, I think, philosophy of it. Sarah, would you like to comment?
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for this pertinent question. Obviously, what happens outside of a school is hugely important. I think one thing that we've also tried to see in our work is to not only engage within schools, but with the whole community, and how to deal with, how to engage with parents, how to deal with media literacy, also how to touch upon controversial issues, how to discuss them, because that's part of our daily life, and we have some really good resources for that. So we are aware of this, and it's hugely important, the wider context of education, and it is political, it can be very political, of course.
Just to come in briefly on that, I mean, I very much agree with what you said in terms of the risks of indoctrination through education. And I think one of the things ministers in government have to think about very carefully when they're looking at curriculum and when they're engaging in a discussion around curriculum is how to encourage critical thinking, questioning, how to encourage multiple different narratives rather than one fixed narrative, particularly when it comes to history. When I was schools minister for a period of time 2 years ago, and one of the things I had to work on was political impartiality guidelines for teaching. It gets very, very complicated when you get into the issues of contested histories and narratives. But I think ensuring that children understand that there is a debate and that there are valid viewpoints on both sides of that debate is an important start. And making sure that we avoid any form of indoctrination, I think is absolutely crucial. So these are part of that wider context in which I think all education systems have to operate. I think it's really important that the European Declaration of the Right to Education includes the right to be educated in a religion and a philosophy which the child understands, and that means we have to teach multiple contested different points of view. And getting that right is not straightforward, but I think it's something that every system has to try and aspire to.
Thank you very much. Next question.
Thank you very much. I'm Scott Harrison, my name. I'm the trustee at the Association for Citizenship Teaching. I'm grateful to Sarah for citing some of our projects, which we're very proud of in schools around the country. Just to say, however, that arising from the discussion, we've seen the importance of teachers really knowing their ground on teaching, but often very sensitive, yes, political issues. The importance of impartiality, the importance of knowing about the law. We need specialist teachers who know their stuff. At the association, we're trying to promote this and to get more schools to give the curriculum time that's needed to develop citizenship properly. Again, something that was there again. We do still have some barriers. We've got great projects, but there are schools where citizenship is still, shall I say, hard to find, and hidden within frameworks like personal and social health education. And unfortunately, Ofsted's decision to implement citizenship through personal development rather than quality of education remains a barrier because it means it still isn't a subject of status of other curricular subjects. So there's work to do, and our website will still be good.
Thank you. And on your question and on its application to, or challenge to British education to get that aspect of balance, right. Robert Walker, I wonder if you could comment again.
I mean, I'm entirely sympathetic to your point of view in terms of the importance of citizenship education. I think one of the things I've paid tribute many times to the work of Lord Blunkett in pressing the case for that and introducing space within the national curriculum. I think the big challenge comes with the fact that too few people are able to take an exam in it, and therefore it is often squeezed out in the exam-focused curriculum in secondary schools. And I think that's where I have raised, indeed, your very point about Ofsted and the way that it's inspected. I agree with more space needs to be. I think it's also something else that my select committee are looking at is financial education. Huge amount of the useful content of financial education is in the citizenship curriculum, but not enough pupils are accessing that. So your point about making more space and time for citizenship would be extremely welcome from that perspective, and I think is something that we need to work on.
Thank you very much. I have a question which comes online, which I will read out. And it comes from Liz Morse, who is Chief Executive of ACT, Association for Citizenship Teaching, working with part of the Council of Europe Education Policy Advisors Network work. And here is the question. It is a key role of citizenship, a national curriculum subject in England, and which includes media and information literacy, to counter the effects of hate and ensure pupils are educated about democracy and human rights and the positive power of digital. Teachers do indeed support and better training in pedagogies to teach about sensitive and controversial issues, and maintain impartiality in classrooms when addressing the complex issues, including some of the current conflicts. The Association for Citizenship Teaching was funded by the Department for Education to develop the deliberate classroom to assist with this. I wonder if Ms. Moore's come online to give us the thrust and encapsulation of her question. But if not, the background which she presents is a very useful one. And again, could I have perhaps a spokesman from the Council of Europe to comment on what this background is?
Okay. I mean, as I understand it, the work that's been done in the UK, there's a lot of it, but one of it is that's groundbreaking is on dealing with controversial issues. And I mentioned this before, but some of them also on hate speech as well. Yeah, and so we get a lot of these examples when we're talking with the other 45 member states about what Britain is doing. So.
Yes, well, thank you. I wonder, before we move on, could I ask each of our last speakers what their thoughts are on this aspect? We've heard from Advosian and Livingston of the case for more effort being made to put together public-private partnerships. Is there not also room for a sort of parallel to that, which is a working synergy between international organizations, such as the Council of Europe, and like-minded NGOs? And I wonder what your thoughts, each of you, are on that, and if you're in favor of that kind of direction, if you would like very briefly to comment on what progress that you're aware of relevant working synergies being put together by people who are doing the same things, but often double handle. They don't exactly do that, but they don't perhaps as much as we would all like, people who are admiring what they do and want are all the keener to get the results and the fruits of the labours of that. And we would probably all believe that that become all the more effective if there was more focused working synergies. What are your thoughts?
Shall I start? I think it's fair to say, from the perspective of Amnesty International, obviously we are a movement in ourselves, so we work with individual members, but also organisations around the world. And in terms of cooperation at the international level, Amnesty has been very engaged with the Council of Europe. We were very active in the conference in Turin a couple of years ago. Just earlier this year, I also took part in a kind of stocktake of where work was happening. So we are talking, we are in conversations from an Amnesty perspective. We also work with the UN. We have a current partnership with the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, which is, we're about to launch a project at the 75th events for the 75th anniversary of the VDHR, highlighting the work of young human rights educators working on issues ranging from masculinity and LGBT rights to gender-based violence, across a whole range of issues from around the world. So we, as Amnesty, we are cooperating, we do cooperate and work in partnerships with other organisations, including international organisations. And I think what's really important, and I think what sort of comes out here, and I think in all the different aspects of the comments being made, that there are multiple, there is a right to education and a right to human rights education, and that can be delivered in different ways. It could be delivered through gaming, it could be delivered through, learning from play from an early age. And it can also be, how do we look at textbooks that are maybe indoctrinating, for example, Russian textbooks on the history of Crimea, for example. So I think there are lots of ways that we can work together. From Amnesty's perspective, we really do call on states to uphold that right to education and the right to human rights education, and are very open to cooperation in those discussions. So thank you.
Well, thank you. We now come to our third session, which looks at action for education. After every debate, probably it is a good thing to ask, is it not? What will come out now in concrete terms? That is, of course, aimed, that challenge, at all of us, parliamentarians, state officials, and the private sector alike. Each of us should ask themselves of what we can do to advance quality education. The UNHCR is doing a lot and has so done for many years in assisting refugees with education. Given the high number of refugees and asylum seekers in Europe, but also in Africa, Asia and America, we are glad to hear online Dr. Rebecca Telford, who is Chief of the Education Section at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in Geneva. Hoping that the online connection to Geneva is functioning well, and I obviously did. If it got through to Kiev, Geneva might be not such of a difficult proposition as well. Now I now call on Dr. Telford to take the floor, please. Dr. Telford, and let us hear from you.
Thank you, and thank you to all of the speakers so far. It's been a very rich conversation, and I wanted to drill down a little bit into some of the big picture on refugee issues, as you noted, in this unprecedented time in history where there's more than 110 million people displaced worldwide, and really think about actions and next steps very much around inclusion in national systems, why that matters and what it takes to make it happen. And I think when I was listening to the speakers beforehand, I was thinking about Sir Ian's point. He's talking about a game in which the child is the hero. And I think we have to imagine the reality where there's a game in which the child becomes a refugee. And there's a whole load of people that they don't know and they don't interface with and feel like they can't influence, who are going to be rolling the dice. So what we do when we roll those dice matters. And I think the real focus on the role of states in upholding rights, the role of states which may not naturally welcome refugees, which may not realise their rights, which may have significant problems and challenges in providing quality education to their own populations. They may struggle to include them in existing systems. And that's the biggest challenge that we have in terms of realising the rights of refugees to education. In Europe, there is a stronger approach, and I think that's largely because many European countries have a system of compulsory education. There are well-established social services which are applicable to all school-aged children, including in some cases children who are actually irregularly within that territory. And inclusion of refugees in national education systems is the default and the most practiced measure in Europe. There's a lot of pieces around supporting children to enter national systems, and I'll talk about those in terms of actions and thinking about detailed approaches later. And whilst this is really great news, I just want to note that actually it's not the case everywhere. The Ukraine crisis has really been unprecedented in Europe. That's not something that I need to tell you, but a lot of that was around the numbers, sheer numbers, the scale of children and their families arriving in what was a very short period of time. And with that scale, even in Europe, with these very robust systems, with significant access to resources, and with systems and frameworks which have worked for, centuries, it has resulted in a shortage of places. It's resulted in stress on systems, shortage of teachers. And I recognise, as an educationalist, there is already a global teacher shortage. It's something that the world is struggling with. And really huge challenges in terms of putting in place support to transition. So whether that's language learning, mental health and psychosocial support and other services. There's been a huge amount of work done to bridge some of those gaps, but thinking about getting back to what works in the long term and what is going to work at scale is going to be really important. And I think it's also recognising, the enrolment of refugee children from Ukraine in host countries actually remains quite low. There's been really significant amounts of work done around this, but only about half of refugee children from Ukraine are in school in Europe. There's a number of reasons for that, some of which is around hesitancy of Ukrainian parents to enrol their children in schools and to use host country curricula because of an expectation to return home soon, right? And potentially a sense of disloyalty in making a home, however temporary it is. As someone who works globally with refugees, it's really common. Nobody expects to become a refugee and nobody expects to stay in displacement. The average displacement is about 17 to 20 years. So the images that sometimes we have of, a refugee camp, a tent, something which is very temporary, isn't actually the case. And so when we're looking at education access and inclusion in national systems, that piece around scale, that piece around understanding that whatever we hope for and however we support children so they're ready to return home when possible, it might be longer than is anticipated. So UNHCR's global policy has always been inclusion into national systems, and that's embedded in the Global Compact on Refugees, which was signed in 2018. That looks at really supporting children to be in classrooms alongside host community children, to access the national curriculum, to access certified accredited pathways. There are amazing opportunities around the use of digital and around the use of technology, but certification and accreditation is absolutely essential. Having the kind of access to education that will create pathways into education, higher education, for example, into employment, whether that's in the host country, where the children return home or they're settled into a third country, is really what matters. And I think looking at the quality of that education and what it gives children in terms of their ability to go ahead to live their life and to contribute to the world is also one of the things which will contribute to potentially the end of cycles of conflict. There's a huge number of refugee situations in the world, thinking about Somalia or DR Congo, where there have been streams of refugees over a number of years. A lot of that is due to huge internal challenges which need to be solved by having a generation of children who are capable of being politicians and peacemakers and people who build the economy. If refugees are not getting that exposure and that experience when they are outside of that country, the chances that there will be continued cycles of conflict and continued cycles of displacement really are there. So with the right support from government departments at a national level, donors and civil society, other partners, refugee hosting countries can fully integrate refugee children and youth into national education systems. And we've seen this in Europe in particular. I'm excited to announce that all these different challenges and needs that we've set out in terms of why sometimes inclusion doesn't happen, but what the benefits are, have been brought together in a pledge for the Global Refugee Forum, which is due to take place in December. That forum is a really key moment for the delivery of the Global Compact on Refugees. And the pledge has already been signed by the UK, by Germany and by Canada, amongst a number of others. And it sets out this core ambition, not just in terms of including refugees in national systems, but also ensuring there is support to host governments so that education can benefit the host population, children who are likely already in vulnerable and marginalised areas of the country, as well as refugees, and to work explicitly on social cohesion, understanding each other and working through education in a way which supports children to have better futures, but also really enables them to work together and become joint global citizens. And that pledge sets out a couple of recommendations. The first one is around states removing existing social, economic and political barriers. And that's particularly around basic education, but there's an important piece there on tertiary, and upholding the existing commitments to international laws and treaties. The aim of all of that is to have refugees accessing education on par with host country nationals. So whatever the education system looks like, whether there's wraparound support, what access looks like, how places are allocated, etc., having refugees able to access that on par with host country nationals also really reduces the chance of conflict, and particularly intra-community conflict, which can be a major issue for refugee hosting countries. The second is around states with support from donors and others to strengthen the capacity of education systems and schools to include and support refugee children for years to come, recognising that however strongly we hope that's not the case, there is a chance that flight is going to be protracted. There's a huge piece in investing on adequate teaching staff, providing additional training and materials. That's not unique within the education systems and sectors that we're involved with globally, but looking at including and integrating refugees into a classroom is a particular skill set. We also call on countries to support refugee teachers, inclusion into national teacher management. So lots of people come as refugees having had careers, having had good jobs. Maybe they haven't got their certificates, maybe then they would not be qualified in the country, but looking at where it's possible for them to become integrated into that. The third thing is to recognise and jointly continue to confirm the benefits of inclusion in national systems and work together to achieve that. a lot of this is around providing really targeted, timely information to parents, looking at messaging about school having major benefits, social benefits, well-being, pedagogy, which really outweigh just accessing learning. There is a need and a rationale to being in school with other people, particularly in a country that you've recently arrived in, and that doing that doesn't exclude a future return to the country of origin education system. We've seen for Ukraine and also for Syrian refugees in Turkey, for example, issues with not understanding and not being provided with this information meant that children lost out on years of school. And that has a long-term detrimental impact in their education outcomes and then their ability to contribute to society and provide tailored support to transition children into national systems effectively. There's a lot of great examples on this from Sweden, from Germany, in terms of looking at individual trajectories and support to bring children into those host schools. So I will close there. Thank you.
Floor to James Arrowsmith, Director of the Universities UK International, the London-based Association of Higher Education Institutions in the United Kingdom, which recently helped our country to rejoin, post-Brexit, the EU Horizon Programme on research cooperation with the European Union and associated countries. Many of us will also hope that the United Kingdom may manage to rejoin the EU Erasmus programmes. Mr. Arrowsmith, you have the floor.
No, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today on a really important topic. And I think the discussions so far have been really enlightening, if a little sobering, given the scale of the challenges that have been articulated so far. I wanted to just say a few words about some of the practical things that universities, that our universities here in the UK have done in this space, but also offer some reflections on the lessons that we have learned from the partnerships that we've had with colleagues in Ukraine since the invasion. And so our organisation, Universities UK, we represent 142 UK universities, and within the international team that I lead, we're very much there to support universities to develop, deliver their own sort of international strategies, and realise their global engagement ambitions. And the UK has a really good story to tell in that space. We have, and indeed a lot of the international work really does facilitate that right to education that has been highlighted so far in the discussion. We host more than 679,000 international students here in the UK, and that's often a lot of the focus when people talk about the international activities of universities. I think what's less well known is that there are well over 500,000 students that are studying in more than 200 countries and territories across the world on UK programmes through transnational education partnerships. And those students study on in a wide variety of modes and models, including through partnerships, through branch campuses, but also through online and distance learning as well. And I think, as Lord Vasey suggested, we have a huge global footprint, and I think that offers unique opportunities as well to support this kind of wider agenda. I think it's also important to remember that every university has a social purpose and mission as well. They're there to deliver education, create opportunities, and to foster research collaborations that kind of transform sort of lives in society. And indeed, our kind of strategy at UUK that we've just published has that kind of tagline. It's about thriving universities serving society. And I think it's important for us to recognise that that is not just a national objective. It's not limited in scope to the UK. It really has to be sort of global in purview. The challenges that universities and the academic community seek to address, they are global, they're shared, but the opportunities that they furnish through education have a universal appeal. And I think the World Bank has suggested that demand for higher education is going to grow to almost 400 million by the start of the next decade. And most of that growth is going to be in the global south. And to meet that demand, there will need to be a huge increase in the quality, the capacity and accessibility of systems across the world. That cannot be addressed through international students and global mobility. And that is a real challenge. It will require a very significant level of investment, reform of education at all levels, including the development of teachers, of academics, and the professional services and communities that actually wrap around kind of tertiary education in the 21st century. I think as a mature system, with those extensive sort of global links and experiences in fostering education partnerships across the world, the UK higher education community can and should play a really important role in supporting those sort of objectives. And I think indeed we are sort of seeing that. So universities here are beginning, I think, to shape their international strategies around things like the Sustainable Development Goals, reflecting on the role that equitable transnational education partnerships can play, and also being a sort of a cornerstone of responsible and impactful approaches to internationalization. And I think if doing that globally is a challenge, it is obviously a challenge that's magnified greatly if you consider the difficulties that are faced by displaced people trying to access education. I think Dr. Telford just spoke of more than 100 million sort of people. And so any of those challenges of just building capability in systems around the world are absolutely magnified when we consider displaced learners. However, we do have a lot of examples of really good practice in the UK sector, many of which actually have a really long history. If the University of London Worldwide Programmes team was here, they'd be telling you that they've been offering distance learning for, I think it's 150 years. Since the first programmes were set up. So, and they work in incredibly difficult and contested territories all across the world, through wars, through crisis. And so it just goes to show that, you know, UK universities have been doing this for a very, very long time. So there's a huge amount of expertise that we can bring to this. We also have institutions such as the British Council, and I think it's something that we need to value far more than we do, actually, and recognise the role that it plays. I think its presence in many of the world's most challenging sort of environments is absolutely vital to the role that our universities can play in supporting education, offering English language training, and actually helping our members, our universities, to navigate complex systems, local challenges, so that they can foster those education partnerships that have an impact locally. There have been some really excellent programmes that have been funded by the UK governments. For example, the Sphere programme, initially funded by DFID. And one of the projects that came through that, the Padalea project, led by King's College London, actually delivered accredited learning to displaced learners in refugee camps in the Middle East. And so there are excellent sort of examples through that. And we are indeed working with UNHCR and many of our universities there around looking at how we can support sort of humanitarian sort of crises and through things such as the Universities of Sanctuary initiatives. But I think that one thing where we have absolutely, I think, sort of learned a huge amount is through our work with Ukraine. And I think the response that we've seen by universities, I think what it demonstrated is what can actually be achieved when the policy, the funding, and the regulatory environment is actually aligned with the kind of enthusiasm, the expertise, and the initiative of universities, but also when there's public and political support there as well. Our universities, we don't exist in a vacuum, and so the response to the crisis in Ukraine was really enabled because all parts of the system, I think universities, government, officials, funders and regulators, both in the UK and Ukraine, were able to work together. And in what was, I think, a uniquely kind of supportive and enabling way, which included things like the visa and immigration system being adapted to support Ukrainian learners to come to the UK, but also funding as well. For example, the student loan system was opened up in ways that I think was just highlighted by Dr. Telford to ensure that Ukrainian students could actually work, could study here in the UK on the same terms as domestic students. Just the cornerstone of the UK's university response, though, has, I think, been our UK-Ukraine twinning programme, which has led to 100 university-to-university partnerships being established, each with a unique but long-term focus and sort of commitment. And the priority of those partnerships was really to help ensure that our Ukrainian partners, Ukrainian universities, but the whole of the system could continue working through the conflict and sort of crisis. But that partnership and the twinning relationships that were established, they require a huge investment of time and resources. And that kind of approach isn't really possible at scale in response to multiple humanitarian crises simultaneously. And I think it was reflective of a very particular set of circumstances that include that really high level of political and public support sort of as well, and that was key. And while that's been a fantastic initiative, I think its long-term potential is always going to be limited without dedicated support and without long-term support. We've seen significant investment from government, from research funders on that kind of research side. So setting up research partnerships, the Researchers at Risk programme. There hasn't been the same on the education partnership side. What has happened is that UK universities have had to kind of support that work themselves. And I think that there are always going to be limits about what we can do as a higher education community without that kind of long-term sort of funding and policy support. So I think there's huge lessons from what we have done working in collaboration with partners in Ukraine. But if we are going to mobilise the expertise within our universities to support displaced learners wherever they are, and those that actually just find themselves living under conditions of war and sort of crisis more broadly, then we do need that kind of long-term focus, that targeted support. And it's not just funding, it is also the policy support as well. Otherwise, I think our response is always going to be fragmented and will actually fail to deliver to its full potential. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and for your extremely positive messages on the evidence of existing good results from education partnerships and the future prospects of that getting better and better. This leads us to our last discussion round. Who might want to start with a question? Yes, please.
Sorry, I'm Sue Garden. I speak for the Liberal Democrats in the Lords on education. I'm desperately sorry that other commitments meant I couldn't be here for the earlier speeches. But what I did want to throw into this is that we have a House of Lords committee looking at 11 to 16 education. Our report will come out before Christmas, but virtually everybody who's given evidence has indicated that GCSEs are not fit for purpose. They don't equip young people for life. They're far too academic, and so there are a whole load of youngsters who are brilliant at practical things, but they're not academic, and they regard themselves as failures because the system says that to them. The importance of IT and technical stuff is really vital for this, which is another of our conclusions on this, and internationalism. And I was once a linguist, and so can I just endorse everything you say about Horizon and Erasmus? I think it was utterly iniquitous that we were allowed to leave Erasmus. Boris Johnson, of course, promised us that we wouldn't, which is one of very many promises he failed to fulfill. But do please look out for our report, because I think you'll find it's relevant to a lot of the issues you've been discussing this morning, because and the international aspect of things is so important as well. As I say, the fact that languages have dwindled so desperately in our schools is really bad. You know, we've got to be out there talking other people's languages. We can't assume that everybody's going to speak English, even if we speak it very loudly. And so I think that's, you know, that really is one to take away. But as I say, I will look forward to reading the report from the speakers that I missed, and I'm so sorry I wasn't here for those.
Lord Tom and Susan, thank you very much indeed for that intervention and for drawing attention to that report.
Yes.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
So I just wanted to share one of the research projects that we've been doing as part of Relief Center at UCL with communities in Lebanon, particularly working with the refugee communities. And one of the things that we developed was a collaborative, massive open online course, which is often developed by MOOCs,
I believe.
So university academics usually develop the course and then deliver it, but we actually, from the very beginning, collaborated with Lebanese universities and refugee teachers and educational practitioners to identify the areas that were important for refugee learners in those communities and design the course and ran the course collaboratively, and over 25,000 educators and teachers, mainly from Lebanon and from around the world, have participated in the co-MOOC, as we call it, co-designed MOOC. So it is called Transforming Education in Challenging Environments. And some of the things that we were discussing earlier today are actually brought into discussions in those 4 weeks learning activities for educators, policymakers, and researchers. So I think one of the biggest challenges for refugee learners in higher education in particular is the lack of accreditation of their learning, because higher education is expensive online, like school education or basic education, which is of course expensive, and many children are out of school in refugee contexts. But higher education in particular is problematic. I think there is a real opportunity for UK universities like University of London, Open University, and UCL and other universities to provide a subsidized qualifications for refugee learners in higher education, so that their only portable asset, which is education, could be nurtured and their future could be enhanced. And I wonder whether there is anything that the parliamentarian colleagues and UK universities can potentially do to provide qualifications which are recognized by UK universities at a lower cost or subsidized cost in partnership with other organizations.
On that point, would you like to answer?
Yeah, it's not a direct answer to the subsidised point, because that is, I think, is a sort of policy question. But I think one of the big opportunities of the lifelong learning entitlement legislation is to provide greater degree of micro-accreditation, so that universities can provide short courses, parts of courses, which then count towards qualifications further on. That may be part of the solution there. The other thing is more of an observation, which is that one of the things we look at through our further education system in particular is so-called ESOL, English as a second or other language, and support for learners of English. I think one of the big problems with that system at the moment is it's too focused on very part-time courses which do not lead to accreditation, rather than more immersive courses that do. And I think it's one of the things we need to look at, that ESOL provision, which I know universities are often going above and beyond what they're required to do by legislation at the moment in order to provide immersive ESOL courses. But one of the big challenges is we don't have that framework for accreditation. So I think that's absolutely something that would be very valuable for refugee learners who are often actually getting that support from universities. And I know that my university in Worcester provides a remarkable degree of support there. But the big challenge is at the moment the system isn't set up to provide that accreditation. I do think the lifelong learning entitlement legislation should help, because it allows for that micro accreditation and accumulation of different elements of accreditation in building up qualifications.
Yeah, just sort of very briefly, and yeah, absolutely. So many universities are already sort of undertaking work in this place. I mentioned the Padalea program as well, Padalea program, sorry, and that the focus of that was on providing sort of credentialed learning as well. So there was accreditation for the learning that took place there. I think you're right. There's always sort of more to do here. I do think a lot of this again comes down to the kind of the funding modalities in the UK system don't make that easy at the moment, and that kind of subsidy. So I think there is definitely an opportunity there though to do more. I would also, just picking up on one of the points that I think it was Serene made earlier though, around there are commercial providers and platforms as well sort of operating in this space, and there are kind of other sort of approaches, and just sort of reflecting I think FutureLearn, which has many partners across the UK system, but also sort of internationally in response to the invasion of Ukraine, but also I think in Afghanistan, made many of their resources available, including accreditation through courses, some of their accredited learning available to institutions and any learners at partner institutions in Ukraine, for example. So there are kind of other mixed models as well that have helped to try and address some of those challenges.
Well, thank you. I wonder if I could possibly ask briefly Dr. Telford this question. My family charity, Siobhan's Trust, is active in Ukraine and helps people in need of food and other things. There's the Latin wisdom quote, plenus ventor non studet libenter, a full stomach does not like to study. In Ukraine and many other parts of the world, it's the reverse, an empty stomach does not like to study. How can the UNHCR help NGOs like mine to bring food to displaced school children?
Thanks. I mean, school feeding is increasingly an issue. Obviously, there are massive problems with malnutrition globally at the moment, and a downturn in socioeconomic status, like not just for donor countries, but also for households. And an increase in the price of basic goods is meaning that more and more children and families are going hungry. So it's a significant issue. Under the UN, there are a number of agencies who work on this in order to streamline and hopefully be as cost effective as possible. World Food Programme is the lead for school feeding and for nutrition in general. And UNHCR works with them to make sure that there are lines of engagement so that they're aware of, which children are in need, where the issues are, where the challenges are, and that the messaging to parents and communities around access to food support and school is really clear. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And I would wish at this stage to thank all our speakers and everybody who has participated so well. And we now come to the winding up of where we are, which is sometimes a difficult task to conclude any conference like this one. Therefore, I'm more than grateful to my successors, Chair of the Committee on Culture, Science, Education and Media of the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly, who is Yevgenia Kravchuk, Member of the Parliament of Ukraine, as well as to Robin Walker, who will also, along with Yevgenia, wind up. And Robin is Chairman of the Education Committee of the House of Commons of the United Kingdom Parliament. May I first give the floor to Yevgenia Kravchuk, who will now address us online.
Greetings again from Kiev. Thank you for organizing this, and my gratitude to my friend and former colleague, Lord Dundee. By the way, Lord Dundee was in Kiev just a few months ago, together with his trust and his friends. I hope to welcome more of your colleagues in Ukraine, and will be most happy to organize any visit. It is very difficult to conclude because these rich conversations, dialogues, but what I feel that we are all on the right side of the history, because we're speaking about how to give the access to the education, to how to make it better, how to enrich it, and the authorities that Ukraine is fighting, one of the authorities in dictatorship, Russia, are thinking how to change the curriculum to make the people obedient without critical thinking, without any ideas what's going on outside of their countries. Same thing with Iran, with Taliban, with North Korea. They're trying to restrict the access to education, and they're trying to make the education as an instrument to have more soldiers that they can send and invade other countries. So again, we are on the right side of the history, and I would like to thank, as the first Deputy Minister of Education of Ukraine, for the help that we get, not just by the government, parliament, but also by the NGOs, by the international organizations, to students and pupils, both in Ukraine, but also that those who are in hosting countries around the globe. Well, of course, education is one of the most fundamental rights, and it not just provides the knowledge, the skills, but also develops the personality, helps to understand the rights and responsibilities of the citizens, and again gives this critical thinking and engage in the participation in the civic life. Today, I'm speaking both on behalf of the Cultural Committee, the Committee on Cultural Education, Media and Science, I am a successor of Lord Dundee, but also I'm speaking as a Ukrainian member of parliament, deputy chair of the humanitarian committee in Ukraine, but also as a mother. And when I was, hearing all of the numbers that the first deputy minister saying about, the percentage who goes online, I decided to make it more simple. I'll just tell how it is on the example of my family and my daughter. My daughter was 8 when the full scale war started, and since the 24th of February and until the end of March, she didn't have any access to education because barely thought whether will be alive or not. And then at the end of March, the online education started. Thanks God, she's I would say privileged more because she stays in the Western Ukraine, which is closer to Europe, closer to the border. So it's more safe if you can say that any spot in Ukraine is safe enough, because we had the missiles hitting a small town where we live. But at least she had access to a laptop. I gave her a laptop, and many kids didn't have a laptop. They were using one phone and were sharing among, with other siblings. And when Lord D asked about the food, well, we actually are doing the reform on the school canteens and the nutrition that pupils get in the school, and that's during the full-scale invasion. So we're doing the reforms during this full-scale invasion. But what these pupils also need is the access to laptops, access to iPads or other tablets, because using mobile for schooling, it's very difficult. But nevertheless, since the September 2022, my daughter, Victoria, was able to go to school physically. Again, because the school had a bomb shelter. And again, she is more privileged than some of the students and pupils in Ukraine, because first of all, we had in the school a bomb shelter, and we are a bit further from the border with Russia, because, for example, in Kharkiv, students cannot even go to schools offline, because if ballistics hits, at first ballistics hits the ground and then the air raid goes on because it's too close. So basically in Kharkiv, how they do it, how they manage, they have classes in the underground. In the underground, students are studying. And also in October 2023, Kharkiv started the first project in Ukraine, was building a totally underground school that can accommodate around 500 pupils. Of course, it's, I think it's strange that we're speaking about the underground schools in 21st century, but that's the reality of the life. Another reality of the life is how the rapid and distracted the education is. For example, right now, there is an air raid in whole Ukraine because the plane that carries the ballistics is patrolling, and it can go in the air for 3 or 4 hours. It means that everything stops. Pupils go to the basement, and if they can, they continue studying. If not, they could be dispersed to their houses. So it's the disruption. And in the terms of the higher education, some of the students didn't have a physical education, a face-to-face education for years, because first COVID, and everyone was online, and then the full-scale invasion. And in many universities, there's not enough of the basements of the shelters, basically to accommodate this number of kids. And I would like to thank again the Association of UK Universities for helping Ukrainian universities. And if any needs, any help should come from the Ukrainian Parliament, I'm ready to convene this help. Basically, that's about the education in times of war. So we do need help with shelters. We do need help with laptops, tablets. We do need help with some sort of educational hubs, because a lot of inner displaced pupils, students, they still have online education. It means they don't have this cooperation with their peers, even if they live inside of the Ukraine, but in different regions. And in my region, we made such projects called educational hubs, where pupils can come and play computer games or do something with the 3D printer or some IT courses, and have these conversations with their peers and social interaction with them, though they are schooling online. Again, another part I would like to cover is education of Ukrainians abroad. Indeed, a lot of the Ukrainians, they still study online when they are in different countries, and that's because they want to return. And if they miss the curriculum, they would have to, miss the year, not to go with the classmates to another year. But also those who do go to the schools in the host countries, we kindly ask you to help them not to lose their identity. We're speaking aloud that Russia is stealing Ukrainian school children identity when they abduct them, bring to mainland Russia, put them to re-educational camps, and forbid to speak Ukrainian. But also we have to help the students that are abroad. They will be enriched with your culture, with languages, English, German, French, whatever languages they will learn, and they will help to rebuild Ukraine with these skills. But also they have to have access to Ukrainian books, to Ukrainian libraries, to Ukrainian teachers as well that might be in those host countries as refugees as well, because it gives the linkage to the country, and we do want them back. Again, I would like to underline the work that we do in Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe and in our Cultural and Educational Committee. I personally keep the issue of education as the chairperson at the top of our agenda. And again, I would like to thank Lord Dundee for his excellent work. And I've had an honor to present his latest report and resolution about promoting online education and research across national borders. He had to leave the assembly at that time, but I was presenting this resolution during the standing committee. And right now, the committee is currently working on several other reports on education. It's about the online education and special education needs of children with disabilities and learning difficulties, and also the role of sites of remembrance, places of commemoration, education for democratic citizenship. So that this linkage between the democracy and education is very important, and we do work in the committee on that. And also I'm working myself on the resolution about the country and the erasure of cultural identity in war and peace. And I had to dig in even more to these war crimes that Russia commits. And we did have hearings with the participation of the school principals that were on the occupied territories. And it's clearly something horrible what Russians do on the occupied territories. They changed the subjects, they bring the textbooks from Russia, they rewrite the history, they forbid to learn Ukrainian, they rewrite the history of our nation, saying that this nation never existed, this country is fake and everything. And that's what they teach to the students and to the pupils that are in Russian occupied territories. So thanks again for organizing this event. I encourage both British parliamentarians and government and NGOs and everyone to cooperate with Ukraine, and your ideas and suggestions are very much welcomed. Thank you for attention.
Well, thank you so much, Evgenia, for your contribution today and for all the useful work which you continue to do in the Council of Europe in Strasbourg and as a parliamentarian in your own country. Finally, I will ask Robin Walker to present us his conclusions. His Education Committee has been dealing with major legislation on higher education in our Parliament. Robin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Lord Dundee. And it's a great honour to be here and to have an education, I think, in education as a human right. It is something that we often get very obsessed with in our own systems, at looking at the internal workings of what is going on in one country or another. And I think this discussion has really raised our eye line above that to the international challenge. And I think it's a pleasure to follow Evgenia, who made that very powerful point about being on the right side of history by supporting education as a right. I think that is something we need to remember. We need to remember the derivation of these rights that came after the turmoil of the Second World War and the desire to protect the right of people to understand citizenship, democracy, engage with all those issues. Right in your opening comments, Lord Dundee, you mentioned education as a cornerstone right. And I think that's absolutely vital that we remember that. It is so important for accessing and understanding all the other rights on which we depend. And I think we've had an incredibly rich discussion today. I'm not going to try and summarise every part of it because that would be impossible. But in my role as chairman of the Education Select Committee, we are looking at those rights to vocational education, to languages, to access to education for people with special educational needs, which is so vitally important and a continuing challenge, even in a relatively undisturbed country such as the UK. We're doing work on a statutory register for children not in school to understand where children who are being home educated actually are and whether they're getting the support that they need. I was very struck by the Ukrainian minister's introduction and the points he made about 2 million children facing disruption to their education to the extent that they can't have face-to-face learning. And Ed Vaizey and others are right to point out that distance learning has great benefits and great supports as a standby, but I think we all learned during the pandemic the limitations of that distance learning as well. And I think when it comes to education as a right, the right to engage directly with your peers and with teachers is so important to that as well. I thought Fabian Hamilton gave a brilliant summary of the derivation of the rights and talked about some of the legislation before us. His point about the curiosity of children, I think, reduces this to a very human level. And again, Evgenia's point about thinking about this from her own family. I know my 5-year-old daughter is so passionately excited to be at school, and that's something I want to foster and encourage and support. And we want to allow that excitement to take place for children all over the world. I thought Ian Livingston's contribution around the importance of creativity and STEAM, the development of STEAM, very important. Of course, he leaves that legacy not just of an academy in his name, but also of computer science being a proper part of the curriculum, something that I think we want to grow and grow that access of children, not just to the tools of using digital skills, but actually the tools of creating. As well, very important. Lord Vaizey talked about the importance of the UK as an international player and education as an export, which is a huge and important export for the United Kingdom. Again, from Universities UK, we heard about the partnerships and the value of that, and how we can work with other countries. And I have to say, I wasn't aware that there were 100 different partnerships with universities in Ukraine. That is fantastic work, very important. One of the things I had to do as schools minister when I was there was during the outbreak of the Ukrainian conflict and Russia's unjustifiable attack on Ukraine, is to look at how, having steeled our school system to support refugees from Syria and Afghanistan and Hong Kong, we suddenly had this big influx of people who wanted to welcome and support from Ukraine, and actually working not just at the UK central government level, but also with local authorities, with schools, with multi-academy trusts, to make sure that they had the capacity to receive and support those students, but also then, as our Ukrainian speakers have pointed out, the capacity to access their own curriculum. And that point in education as a human right about being able to understand your own culture, your own religion, your own background, I think is so important. We've had some excellent contributions from the floor, and I think the point about how we handle conflicts and how we provide people with the tools to question different narratives is so vital, particularly when we see what's being done by Russia to Ukrainian children who they are denying that right to understand their own national perspective. I think one thing sort of I'm reminded of through the discussion is the UK played a very prominent role in securing the so-called Sustainable Development Goals or Millennium Development Goals, and education is absolutely at the heart of those. I raised the issue during the King's speech about how we secure the right to education as well as the right to life for children facing the current conflict in the Middle East, and I think that's something we absolutely have to keep on focusing on. But for me, this has been a fabulously rich and powerful discussion. I think really important that we take away some of those points, such as Amnesty's point about 82% of young people wanting to learn more about human rights and wanting to hear more about that side of things. I think that figure of more than 100 million people displaced worldwide is a reminder of the huge global challenge we have in this space as well. So I'm very grateful for the education that I've received as part of this. Keen that my committee can continue to play its part in looking at these issues and making sure that actually through the Council of Europe and through the UK's role in that, we can continue to work with partners to support the values of education as a human right and continue to develop our own citizenship curriculum, our own offer to students domestically to understand about this. Last week was Parliament Week. Members of Parliament and lords from all over the country will have been going into schools to talk about how democracy works and these perspectives. And one of the things I'm often struck by when I talk to young people in schools is they are passionate about the opportunities for other young people around the world. They're passionate about the opportunities for young people to play a part in meeting our climate and biodiversity targets and our environmental goals. We have to make sure education provides them with the tools to do that. And we have to make sure that education provides children around the world with the opportunity to engage with those global goals. So thank you for the opportunity to take part in today's discussion. I very much look forward to scrutinising the work of the government in this space, but also continuing to challenge as to how we support education as a human right.
Robin, thank you very much indeed. And I will now close the conference. It's been, I think we all agree, very inspiring and uplifting and, as you would say, educational, really, on the slightly not always about theme of education put as a human right. And it's been, for me, a great pleasure and of huge interest to hear everything which has been said and I value very much all contributions from the floor and from people on the speakers list. I join Yevgenia Kravchuk and Robin Walker in concluding that we cannot simply sit back and instead constantly need to analyse instead the position of education in the United Kingdom, in Europe and everywhere internationally, then proceed to deliver concrete improvements and actions. Therefore, John Howe and myself will be very glad to continue this discussion and to seek joint synergies with each of you as a follow-up to this conference. Thank you again for your contributions, and many thanks also to the parliamentary team of skillful operators who have enabled the efficient procedures in this room, as well as the successful communications online to Geneva and Kiev and elsewhere. Before telling you that the conference is closed, what I hope very much is all of you will be able to join me for a cup of coffee downstairs, which we could go to, all of you, if you've got 10 or 15 minutes to spare now. And if you would like to, when you go out of the door, just stay where you are. You can be shown where to go when we get some coffee. So, ladies and gentlemen, the conference is now closed.
Thank you. Yes, my late husband was at King's School.
Oh, was he? Yeah.
He was chairman of the
Thank you for staying the whole time.
I had a fascinating